If it's Wednesday, this changes everything? It might. Abortion rights wins big on the ballot in ruby red Kansas. Turnout soars. Campaigns across America prepare for a midterm election, unlike anything we've seen in a long time. Plus, deepening divisions inside the Republican Party as Trump-backed candidates rack up more primary wins, but the traditional wing of the party did turn in one of its best primary nights so far. What it means for the future of the party, the midterms, and the country straight ahead. And threats to democracy in battleground America. Michigan's Secretary of State, the state's chief election official, joins me on the rise of voter fraud conspiracy theories and the Trump-backed candidate who's trying to unseat her. Happy Hump Day and welcome to Meet the Press. Now I'm Chuck Todd. The midterm landscape changed seismically last night. And now everyone in American politics, from the White House to the State House, and every election in between, is trying to determine where this is headed next. After voters in what you might call ruby slipper red Kansas overwhelmingly sided with abortion rights advocates, striking down a proposed constitutional amendment that would have paved the way for the state legislature to increase abortion restrictions in the state, perhaps banning abortion completely. The vote loudly confirmed hopes among Democrats that abortion could be a powerful motivating issue in the midterms. We've been seeing clues this summer that these midterms might not be going what you might say is the normal way for a president's first midterm. There have been signs that political winds could be shifting for his party ever so slightly. We saw the increase in voter enthusiasm, a bounce in midterm polling, which was notably decoupled from Biden's sagging job approval ratings, stronger than expected fundraising, and quite a few Senate races. And then Kansas happened. Turnout last night was huge for an August primary day. In fact, it rivaled general election numbers. Unaffiliated voters turned out in huge numbers. Steve Kornacki is going to be here momentarily. We'll explain just how big that turnout was and why that is what could matter in November. This is what Republicans have been afraid of quietly, that voters were saying that they've gone too far. So what happens now? First off, we're going to see a lot of midterm messaging strategy change pretty quickly, with Democrats recalibrating their pitch to center it on freedom and reproductive rights. President Biden already held an event today on abortion access. Expect a lot more of daily events like these from Democratic leaders. Take a listen about what he had to say about what happened in Kansas last night.
In a decisive vote, in a decisive victory, voters made it clear that politicians should not interfere with the fundamental rights of women. And the voters of Kansas sent a powerful signal that this fall, the American people will vote to preserve and protect the right and refuse to let them be ripped away by politicians. And my administration has their back.
Abortion was the big story last night, but it was not the only story. Elsewhere at the ballot box, candidates backed by Donald Trump had largely a successful night. But we did not see a Republican Party that you could call and claim is in lockstep behind him. One of Trump's impeachment revenge targets, Michigan Republican Peter Meijer, was only narrowly defeated. Arguably, the margin of victory, he may be credited with an assist from a Democratic campaign group. But the two Washington representatives, Dan Newhouse and Jamie Herrera Butler, who are also on Trump's target list, are not only running ahead of their Trump-backed opponents, but are likely, thanks to the state's unique top two system, going to be able to face a general election without some Trump-backed candidate. In Arizona, Trump's candidates won all the way up and down the ballot, with his one pick, Kari Lake, looking, the one that's not called yet, looking like she'll emerge as the gubernatorial nominee. All of them have backed various false claims about the 2020 election. None of them won a majority of Republican support. They won thanks to crowded primaries. In fact, on our Meet the Press election special last night, as we were watching the returns come in live on the air, the state's sitting attorney general told me his Republican Party in Arizona is divided. Folks, the party that's more united usually has a leg up in the midterms. And after last night's results in Kansas and beyond, it's hard to argue that Republicans are the more united party. They just simply aren't. Dasha Burns is on the ground for us in Kansas. Vaughn Hillyard's in Arizona. And we've got Steve Kornacki at the Big Born. Let's start with Dasha in Kansas. And, you know, everybody said it. This was literally the first test of abortion actually being on the ballot. And I think the biggest story is the turnout, and the turnout of voters that don't usually show up in an early August primary. How did they make that happen?
Chuck, I really don't think we can overstate just how big of a deal this is. The first ballot test for abortion rights, and the answer was clear, and it was decisive, and it was in Kansas. I mean, you said it there, a ruby red state, and here you had such an overwhelming message from Kansans that they want to protect abortion rights here. And listen, the no vote, the abortion rights advocacy side, they had a lot of headwinds here. This was a primary election, smaller turnout. Tends to be a more conservative turnout, right? There was a lot of misinformation, including text messages sent to voters just before Election Day, trying to confuse what the yes and the no vote meant. And still, the message resonated. And here's why. Look, as I was talking to voters here, every single Democrat I talked to, unsurprisingly, was voting no, right, was voting in favor of abortion rights. But not every Republican I talked to was voting yes. In fact, many Republicans I talked to, including people of faith, even pastors, telling me that they believe that this is a choice that a woman should make between her and her doctor, and they certainly feel like this was going too far. They've watched what has happened in these surrounding states. They've watched them go dark, enact these very extreme bans here, and didn't want to see that here in Kansas. And they said that, and they said that loudly. And last night, I talked to some of the women. We were on the air with you, Chuck, when that moment happened. And there was so much emotion. There was so much relief. There was also a ton of surprise because, frankly, nobody was really expecting this. You know, as I've been talking to advocates here on the ground for abortion rights, they were cautiously optimistic. Some were even pessimistic at best. They thought this would be a narrow victory. Nobody expected this. Nobody expected this level of turnout. And the question, you know, we had, which way are Kansans going to go, but also how many of them are going to show up? We got a resounding answer to whether or not this is going to be a galvanizing issue for the midterms in November. And I want you to listen to the message that women last night told me they were sending with this vote.
The government doesn't know what a woman is going through, and that's between her, maybe her faith and her family and her life situation to decide what choices she has to make. You may be against abortion for yourself, but you can't be against it and make the choice for someone else.
They were asking us to strip the rights, the privacy rights of 51% of our population. That's not okay.
And Chuck, we've got a storm brewing here, but I could also argue that this was a storm brewing in Kansas. This turnout, I thought you'd like that one. But no, seriously, these numbers are staggering. I mean, in Johnson County, the largest county in Kansas, 53%, almost half the state overall showing up. This is just absolutely incredible. It says everything. And there are a lot of strategists and a lot of war rooms right now making some new calculations today, Chuck.
Just be careful of windstorms in Kansas there, Dasha. I hear they could sweep you away, and you might meet some odd characters. Anyway, Dasha Burns on the ground for us in Kansas.
I'll click my heels a few times here.
I appreciate it. Thanks. You don't often get to do all these metaphors, but the dad in me can't help himself. Let me move over to Vaughn Hillyard in Arizona. And Vaughn, it's one of these ways where if you squint one way, look, it was a dominant night for Trump and Trumpism on the Arizona ballot. Except it wasn't a resounding set of victories. These were closely fought. The established wing of the party at least went down swinging. The curiosity I have is how united is this party going to be by November?
I mean, we're talking about, state legislative seats, too, that went to these more far-right, Trump-like figures compared to those more Doug Ducey-type legislative candidates here. This is up and down the ballot here in Arizona. It's not just Kari Lake who appears like she will be the likely gubernatorial candidate here from Arizona, or Mark Finchem, or Abe Hamadeh, or Blake Masters here. You know, if you're Doug Ducey, you're not walking away with many wins here today. I was near Scottsdale yesterday at a polling location, and I was talking to the chairwoman of actually Doug Ducey's legislative district, and she is was that one rebel rouser left in the Arizona Republican Party going up against the likes of Kelly Ward. But as we stood there was acknowledgement that this Republican Party here in Arizona is essentially defunct of any of that John McCain remnants anymore. And yes, some of those races were maybe closer, but ultimately a win is a win here. And we're looking at if Kari Lake is able to pull off a victory in the November elections, you're looking at a Republican legislature helmed by a Arizona governor who is exactly in the molds that Donald Trump would envision.
You know, Vaughn, 3 weeks ago, this field was a bit more crowded. Matt Salmon was running an active campaign. I mean, basically the siren song, I guess, that went out to the establishment wing of the party. Did that really close the gap? Did this make it closer than it would have been a month ago when Matt Salmon was more active and the sort of the establishment wing hadn't really rallied around Robeson yet?
Right. I think that it helped to incrementally close that gap there, but he actually pulled off about 20,000 votes himself in this primary here. And when you're looking at a tight margin here, because his name was ultimately on the ballot, he didn't get it out in time here. But also Karen Taylor Robeson, she made the decision to come campaign with Mike Pence and with Doug Ducey and with part of the Republican electorate here. Those are not popular individuals, but that was a decision made by Karen Taylor Robeson to do so. And I think it's why we're just outside of Kari Lake's campaign headquarters here. She just held a press conference a few moments ago, and I asked her the very question. Look, I mean, I said it was more than just, campaign rivalries. You personally attacked Doug Ducey, Mark Brnovich, the McCain family, suggesting that John McCain reached up from his grave to hold onto control of the Republican Party, personally attacked the husband of her opponent, Karen Taylor Robeson. I said, number one, do you need them? And number two, could you understand why they wouldn't come to your side? And she compared it to a family that has its issues, but ultimately everybody needs to come together. But I think that's what we're going to be looking at. There's 95 days to come around together. Kari Lake was more than a Trump-aligned figure. She was something much more than that. And the question is, can she galvanize that part of the party, that establishment wing of the party, in order to pull off a win here in November?
Is it a galvanizing force, or is she a distraction that costs them not just a gubernatorial seat, but a Senate seat, AG, Secretary of State? Whatever happens, it's pretty clear Kari Lake is the linchpin of Arizona's election season going into November. Vaughn Hillyard on the ground force in Arizona. Vaughn, thank you. All right, Mr. Kornacki, a couple of things. First of all, is Arizona, we haven't called it yet. What would somehow change everybody's prognostication here? It certainly looks like you'd rather be Lake than Robeson. What don't we know that could turn the tide here for Robeson?
Yeah, so there are still, you see about 80% in Maricopa County. This is the largest county by far in the state. This is the largest source of outstanding votes. And I think we're expecting sometime in the evening hours tonight to get the next big batch from Maricopa County. And the question is, obviously, Taylor Robeson's going to have to win that vote, whatever comes out tonight. If she wins it, I think we could talk about this still potentially being interesting. But what you're looking at here, you're going to be some combination of votes that were dropped off, ballots that were dropped off at polling places yesterday in person. Folks filled them out at home, dropped them off in person. We found in 2020 that sort of characteristically tended to be a more Trump-favorable vote. There may also be some votes that just arrived in the mail at polling places on Monday that are included in that as well. The general rule, though, has been, we saw this, what put Kari Lake into the lead in the overnight hours last night was when they counted up the same day vote. Right. The votes that were cast in person yesterday. Trump voters we saw in 2020 like to vote same day, and Trump-backed candidates voters were doing that in Arizona. She was winning the same day vote by more than 2-1 in Maricopa, bigger margins elsewhere. So if those votes that were dropped off in person yesterday and the latest arriving mail ballots are even remotely like the same-day vote was.
Yeah.
Like, if Lake is just winning them by 2 points, that's all she needs to do because she's already ahead. So Robeson has got to make a comeback with a sort of unlikely batch of ballots to make a comeback with. But Maricopa's the biggie. They're going to have a big batch in a few hours, so we'll see.
All right, let's move to Kansas. And I think it's sort of and I want you to showcase, what was interesting to me is it didn't matter the county. The overperformance of Biden's numbers by the no vote seemed to be almost the same across the board. You know, if Biden got in the high teens in a county, no got maybe low 30s. And if Biden got 50 in a county, it suddenly was in the mid 60s. Is there anything is that what you saw across the board?
Yeah, no, and I mean, what it points to, I think, clearly is here for the no side to be upwards to be near 60% here, they had to get a substantial number of Republican voters to vote no on this. I mean, one way of looking at this is if you added together every vote that was cast in the Democratic primary in Kansas yesterday, and you added to that every independent vote that came out and was cast in the referendum, it would not add up. It would be well short, almost 100,000 votes short of the total for the no vote. Mm-hmm. So that means even if you assume that every Democrat and every independent who voted no, you'd still need about 20% of Republicans to have voted yes. And surely some independents voted yes, and there are even some Democrats who voted yes. So I think realistically, it wouldn't be crazy to say that upwards of 30% of Republicans in Kansas ended up voting no on this thing yesterday. I mean, give you some examples. Here's a county with some historical Republican significance, Russell County. Nice. Bob Dole's old home county, right? Staunchly.
Arlen Specter as well, by the way. To go old school. Only you and I would do that, but anyway.
That's true, too. Trump got 81% of the vote here. Biden got 17. Look at this.
Wow.
The no side sitting there at 45%. And you see this all throughout western Kansas in these small, rural, heavily Republican counties.
Yep.
So we talk a lot about the suburbs outside Kansas City, but it is a statewide story.
And very quickly, there's two types of swing voters in American politics, and there's one type of swing voter that everybody wonders about in midterms, and that is the voter that votes in presidential elections only. Who showed up? Yeah, there was over 100,000 people showed up to just do this one exercise.
Yeah, and you heard it from Dasha, too. I was looking at where are the counties that sort of disproportionately had the highest turnout. And actually, right now, Johnson County, which is the biggest in the state. Johnson County accounted for about 25% of the vote in Kansas in the 2020 presidential election. It was closer to 27% the last I looked in this referendum. The turnout there was over 50%. Again, this is just a classic. We see a bunch of these all across the country. Big, giant, sprawling, metropolitan, suburban county that's gone from Republican to Democratic in the Trump era. And here it is, socially moderate, nearly 70% no in Johnson County.
Steve Kornacki, we had a great primary night for people that love the numbers game. As always, sir, thank you. Great stuff.
Hey, thanks a lot.
You got it. We have some sad breaking news to report at this hour. Our NBC affiliate in Indiana is reporting, and now House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy is confirming via tweet moments ago that Indiana Republican Congresswoman Jackie Walorski was killed in a car crash this afternoon. Congresswoman was the ranking member of the House Ethics Committee. She'd been representing Indiana's 2nd District since 2013. According to Indiana's local Indiana affiliate, the Congresswoman's district director and communications director were traveling with her and were also killed in this crash. We're seeing an outpouring of support and condolences, not surprisingly, from both Democrats and Republicans on social media as this news travels through Washington circles. We'll bring you any more information that we have as soon as we have it. But Congresswoman Jackie Walorski and 2 key aides killed in a car crash earlier today. Coming up, we're not in Kansas anymore. What can Democrats learn from the strategy that put turnout through the roof last night? And can it be replicated in November? And later, he was perhaps the greatest sports announcer of all time. We're going to remember Vin Scully, who saw history being made and made some history of his own. You're watching Meet the Press now.
What's the message that Kansans sent to the rest of the country tonight?
Don't mess with us. Seriously, there's more of us than there are of them who are trying to attack our reproductive rights and freedom. And I think we sent a message that lies, manipulation, voter suppression. The other side can try and use those as tactics to oppress us, but they don't work. We know our power, and we're going to keep showing up to defend it.
Welcome back. As we talked about a few moments ago, turnout in Kansas last night was through the roof. More than 500,000 Kansans showed up to weigh in on and if abortion should be a constitutional right in their state, and they overwhelmingly voted in favor of protecting that right. So what went into such a decisive win for abortion rights activists in a red-leaning state like Kansas? I'm joined now by Ashley All. She's the spokesperson for Kansans for Constitutional Freedom, the group campaigning for no votes. So let me start with, we're all aware of the sort of the hurdles that were presented with this, the odd wording, early August. So I want to start with the fact that there were no college campuses for you to organize around. How did you communicate to the under 30 crowd? Because clearly those numbers, we don't have an exit poll, some analysis will come in later, but clearly a younger voter did show up.
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. You know, you're right. There has been significant obstacles put in our way since this passed onto the ballot in 2021. The wording was complicated. It was on a primary ballot, which tends to have roughly half as many people show up than the general election. And so we had all these obstacles in our way, and we really got to work over a year ago to build a coalition, a broad and diverse coalition of organizations and stakeholders to fight this amendment. And we brought many Kansans, as you mentioned, from young voters all the way to older voters across the political spectrum together to really engage on this complicated issue. And we were successful, and we are overwhelmed and really inspired by the victory last night.
Look, let me ask you point blank. I'm sure you guys had enough resources. I'm sure you measured public opinion in Kansas. Did you foresee a double-digit win at all?
No. Yeah, I mean, we always thought that it was possible to pull this off. Kansas is a unique state. It's got some independent and kind of pragmatic, veins in it. It has some really great free state history. So it absolutely was a possible win. But even folks like me who've been working in Kansas politics for 18 years were a little bit surprised by the margin.
You know, there's a part of me that looks at this and say, boy, Kansas has been going through what I would call an overreach correction now for almost a decade, right? Which is Republicans may have misread their success in the first decade of the century there. And obviously voters pulled back to the point of a moderate wing of the Republican Party essentially became the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. Since you're a veteran of Kansas politics, how much of this do you see as almost a through line with the Brownback overreach, and how much of this was sort of separate in your mind?
I think this was a really unique situation. I mean, there are obviously some really interesting dynamics going back many, many years in our state. But what I learned, this was my first issue campaign, so it was an experience and a very good learning experience, something that was very personal for me. But what I found and what we learned was that abortion is not a partisan issue. And we approached it as a nonpartisan issue. And so we really did focus on engaging with voters across the political spectrum, progressives, moderates, conservatives, libertarians, and having a conversation about this issue that is a little bit nuanced and willing to accept people that are in the middle. And that was really critical here. This issue is really important to a broad group of people for a lot of different reasons. And we really worked to engage them and mobilize them in the last couple months.
Look, I keep hearing, and the language you used was what I would argue wasn't sort of partisan political rhetoric. It was sort of a different type of more patriotic political rhetoric, freedom and things like that. Give some advice. There's going to be a lot of Democratic campaigns that are going to look at what happened in Kansas and go, hey, I want to do what they did. And then you just said, well, you got to be nonpartisan in your rhetoric. Can you do both and still be a partisan candidate on the ballot and talk about the abortion issue as a nonpartisan issue?
I think you can. I think you have to be willing to have conversations with people who are different than you. You have to be willing to have a nuanced conversation, and also to really look at what's at stake. And what's at stake for us here were constitutional rights. And so we focus very clearly on protecting constitutional rights and freedom for women to make decisions about their health care and their lives free from government interference. The vast majority of Kansans, I would argue the vast majority of Americans, would agree with that.
How much did you benefit from the fact that the other side tried so hard to say this wasn't about whether there's going to be an abortion ban or not? I mean, it felt like, in hindsight, that they might not have gotten trounced as badly had they been more honest about what the attempt was.
I think I agree with you, actually. I was thinking about that last night. I think that they really did mislead Kansans across the board, whether it was on what the state of the current abortion laws are in Kansas, or whether it was, their interest in pushing an extreme ban. They were disingenuous, and the Kansas voters saw through it.
Yeah, they sniffed it out. I mean, that's something you hear, a politician left or right. If it looks like you're hiding something, voters can sniff that out better than you really think. Ashley All, it has to be gratifying to work so hard on something that looked like an uphill battle. Appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective.
Thank you. Thank you.
Up next, how the biggest election night of the summer so far has changed a lot heading into the fall. I don't want to say it's changed everything just yet, but maybe it has. The panel will weigh in next after a quick break. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
Kansas was just the start. If it's going to happen in Kansas, it's going to happen in a whole lot of states. The strong pro-choice turnout we saw last night in Kansas will continue well into the fall. And Republicans who side with these extremist MAGA policies that attack women's rights do so at their own political risk.
Welcome back. That was New York's senior Democratic senator and the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer this afternoon as Democrats look to seize what they believe is some midterm momentum following last night. Democrats like Schumer are hoping the trend continues to November. So joining me now to go through all of this, Democratic strategist Adrienne Elrod, Republican strategist Jim Dornan, and Geoff Bennett, PBS NewsHour chief Washington correspondent and an NBC political analyst, former colleague of mine here. So, Geoff, I want to start with you. Look, Mark Murray and I were talking about this morning. You know, we go into these primary nights, we kind of have an idea how everything's going to go. We were trying to think, as he said, this is probably the most surprised he was by a result since Hillary Clinton beat Barack Obama in New Hampshire, where you just didn't see it coming. That's how unusual. It wasn't that no won, it's that they won so big.
And think of it. Democrats haven't carried Kansas in a presidential election since 1964. They haven't had a Democratic senator in Kansas since 1932. And this Republican-led ballot measure lost by 18 points. That is phenomenal. And you also have to think about what voters in Kansas endured. Triple-digit heat, right? There was a last-minute effort to sort of dupe people by text message to say that if you vote for yes, you're actually voting for no, and vice versa. And then the language itself was convoluted. And so I think Democrats had a big question answered last night, and that was, will all of the anger and activism that exists following the Dobbs decision, will that actually translate into votes? And the answer is yes.
Adrienne, before I get you to weigh in here, I want to play one of the ads that the no side used, because it's the messaging that I think was fascinating, because it borrowed a lot of Republican messaging. Take a look.
They call it a constitutional amendment. The truth, it's a strict government mandate that could put personal rights at risk. Kansans don't want another government mandate. Say no to more government control.
And it's not just here in Kansas, Adrienne. I've noticed ever since the Dobbs decision, there seems to be a lot of Democrats adopting rhetoric that we are used to seeing in Republican ads.
Freedom, personal freedom, freedom to make your own decisions about your bodies, about your own decisions about your own life. I mean, one of the things I found very interesting, Chuck, is not only was this an overwhelming victory for Democrats or anyone who supports choice, but the turnout in some of these rural areas where a lot of Republicans and libertarians, people who don't affiliate with either party, also supported this in wide margins. So the bottom line is this. Maybe in Washington, this feels like a partisan issue. I think what Kansas told us last night is this is not a partisan issue for a majority of the country.
Jim, I had a Republican pollster tell me today. He already didn't have a lot of hair, or he'd have already pulled what remained out of it. He's like, the actual Mississippi law, the 15 weeks, is actually a spot that you can get 50, 60, 70% sort of tolerance, whether you want to call it. And he goes, my party threw it away.
Well, this may be the one issue I happen to agree with Trump on, where he said the Supreme Court decision was going to hurt Republicans, because I think it will fire up the Democratic base. But you're right. I think that a lot of Republican legislators are going entirely too far. There is a lack of tolerance for going towards a total ban, Mitch McConnell, notwithstanding. And I think that we need to understand where the electorate is on this issue.
Are the activist groups, and I had somebody say this, that this kind of happens, becomes self-fulfilling. So the activist groups on this issue in the life community, pro-life community, they're so focused on it, and they're so important to the Republican coalition that too many Republican elected officials think it's more mainstream than it is. Is that, do you sort of agree with that statement?
I do agree with that, but it's much like being a Trump supporter in a Republican primary. You have to move in that direction. And therefore, it's more difficult, because it is such a polarizing issue, to move back in the other direction in a general election. So, you know what? They need to find the happy medium. I hope they do. There's not much time left. We have less than 100 days to the midterms. But I knew that this was going to be coming up, and it was going to be helpful to the other side.
Jeff, I had an analyst on my podcast this morning, Nathan Gonzalez, said, he goes, I used to say I vacillate between a great Republican night and a good Republican night. He goes, after watching Kansas, I'm now vacillating between maybe the ceiling is a good Republican night, but it may be a pure toss-up. Yeah. Maybe the other choice we're looking at here. Do you buy that?
I do. And I think, if you sort of take what happened last night and project it onto the midterms, I've been talking to White House officials, senior administration officials, who have been saying now for months that for them, this Dobbs decision in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, now in Michigan, if they are able to get a similar ballot measure on the ballot there in Michigan, that's the whole ball game. And, as one person put it to me, they said, look at what happened back in 1992, that Bill Clinton was third behind Bush and Perot. And at the time, there was the Supreme Court decision about Pennsylvania abortion restrictions. Bush said he supported it. Clinton said, I don't think that's the right move. Clinton went to number one and stayed there. And states like New Jersey and California, which were nowhere near as blue then as they are now, the Democrats ultimately carried those states. And so that's sort of the model that they're looking to.
All right, Adrienne, if you're Stacey Abrams, you're Charlie Crist, you're Tim Ryan, I'm just thinking of people that are in competitive races but trailing.
Yeah.
Do you drop it all now and just go all in on abortion?
No, look, I think you still have to run a two-track process where you're talking about what you're going to do for American families, what kitchen table issues you're going to focus on, how you're going to get inflation down, how you're going to get gas prices down. But I think you also have to champion what this administration has done so far, which is passed 3 major economic bills with the 4th on the way, and also lean into abortion and call it abortion. I mean, don't hide from it. This is actually, you are taking away abortion access. That is what they are trying to do. And I think what we learned in Kansas last night is this is going to be part of the playbook that we as Democrats will use for a long time to come, not just this cycle, but cycles to come.
How many Republican candidates wish they could borrow the old Bill Clinton phrase of safe, rare, and legal?
Probably most of them now, I would think, at least those in competitive districts. Yeah. And I think there will be a ton of hand-wringing and rethinking between now and Labor Day in the places like the RNC and the NRSC about these issues. I think it hurts, in my opinion, I think it hurts our Senate candidates who are kind of flapping in the wind right now anyway, than it does House candidates. House candidates tend to, House races, they tend to move towards where the country moves. And I think with Biden's numbers right now, I'm not as confident as I was 6 weeks ago about the Republicans taking the House. I still think it's going to happen. I'm completely bearish on Republicans taking the Senate right now.
Look, it's one, and Monmouth, I feel like I'm not crazy about some of these generic ballots that are out there, but Monmouth today, I want to put it up there. You brought up the generic ballot. And we've seen this. The generic ballots have been all over the map. They claim a Democratic lead of +7. But the point is, suddenly the generic ballot, Jeff, over the last 6 weeks, has looked more like a generic ballot in evenly contested election years than it does in a generic ballot that's somehow going to be a wave election. There's no evidence anymore to me that we're headed for a wave election.
I think that's right. And I think you take what's happening with abortion and how that's resonating across the country, and also the Trump factor, that you have these Republican candidates in these contested races in a primary race, so they have to be sort of like, wrap themselves in all things Trump more than they'd have to do in a general election. And all of the revelations from the January 6th investigation, I think all of that is showing up in the polling.
By the way, speaking of Trump, we are now going to see something, and I'm just curious, where the only impeachment folks that are going to survive were in systems that basically don't have primaries. don't have party-run primaries. The top 2 in Washington, top 2, and maybe Lisa Murkowski, top 4 in Alaska. First of all, let me ask you as a partisan, how are you with, if more states move to this top 2 or 3 system, it might be good for moderates. Is it good for parties?
I think it depends on, look, I think a lot of it depends on the district. I mean, look, I'm a moderate Democrat. I would love to see more moderate Democrats and more moderate Republicans in Congress, but I also want to see us win. And this is the situation that we're in right now. We've got to figure out how to win, and we need, especially right now, to figure out how to mitigate our losses going into 2022.
Jim, as a guy who spends a lot of time in Maryland politics, I think you'd love a top 4 system. Oh. But do you think the Republican Party partisans, they're going to fight these attempts to do this, aren't they?
Of course they will, especially the Trumpers will, because that gives them less of a chance. And by the way, in Maryland, as much as they have, Trump just gave away another governorship.
Right. Well, there you go. By the way, the Tim Kaine, Susan Collins bill, can it get, he watered it down to try to get more Republican support. Can it get 10 Republican votes?
Yeah, which bill?
It's Kaine and Collins, where they're trying to codify abortion rights. It's not what the previous bill was. It's closer to what used to be essentially Casey, codify Casey. Okay. Can that get 10 Republican votes?
I think you can get to 9. I don't know who the 10th would be. And this had come up before when I know that Susan Collins was trying to whip some votes around. And the Republicans and even some Democrats would even say openly they don't know how they get to 60.
Well, and that's the issue. Some Democrats are uncomfortable agreeing to some restrictions, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But look, the bottom line is if I was a Republican right now and I looked at what happened last night, I would find every way in my power to support this bill.
To get on that bill.
And there are a couple guys that could. I mean, Richard Burr, Rob Portman, guys that don't have to face the election.
Retiring.
Yeah.
They have to do it quickly, though.
Does Mitch, you'll know if Mitch McConnell thinks it's a way to get the Senate, if he sort of tries to push it to see it happen.
Also the gay marriage bill, I think, will be a key as well.
Yeah, it is something to watch. Adrienne, Jim, and Geoff, thank you all. Sure. Up next, the effort to combat misinformation and election denialism in an election year, in a battleground state. Well, that's the job of Michigan's top election official, and she joins me next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As we've said, primary wins by Trump-backed Republicans are once again raising concerns about the future of election integrity in America. In Arizona, for example, Republicans tapped a gentleman by the name of Mark Finchem. He's their pick, the nominee for Secretary of State. It's a role that would oversee the state's elections. Finchem, who continues to falsely claim Joe Biden did not win the 2020 election, is now one ballot away from running elections in one of the key battleground states. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, 2 Senate committees held hearings on election integrity issues today, and one on reforming the Electoral Count Act and the other on threats to election workers. So joining me now is Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson. She testified at that hearing on threats to election workers. And let me start with that. We can't run an election without nice citizens deciding to, some of them are retirees, some of them are young people, but deciding to essentially, even though they get paid, it's kind of like doing jury duty. It's not an appealing job anymore. How are you going to get enough people to do these jobs?
Well, a couple of things. Certainly, democracy will prevail based on people of integrity on both sides of the aisle choosing to step up and serve. And we have seen many leave the profession over the last couple of years due to the increase in the steady stream of attacks, really fed by misinformation, that we've endured since the 2020 election. But what we've also seen is a lot of people step up to serve. 6,000 new poll workers signed up to work the polls in Michigan's primary election yesterday.
And were these all good people? Were there people with the right motivation for why they wanted to do it, or did you have any? Did you worry about any nefarious actors who were trying to gum up the work?
We worried about nefarious actors, particularly when stories emerged that some were being put or trained to further misinformation. What we saw was actually robust election system run by folks who were more proud than ever to do this work. I mean, I talked to election officials throughout the day and met with poll workers throughout who are working the polls, and there was a change in tempo of their work, and there was a pride there and a steadfast resoluteness that we're going to protect this system that we believe in that I hadn't seen in past elections. So I do think there's a silver lining here to these challenges, that we're going to see the strong continue to be a part of the process, and the process will be stronger as a result.
Nothing stops misinformation more than facts, data, transparency.
Yep.
So as you and I were talking earlier, if you don't follow how election nights work, how primaries work, how the election system works, you might view it as a black box. And you were telling me, you understood that some people maybe just didn't understand how it works, so it was easy to buy into a conspiracy theory. What are some of the transparency best practices that you think you've implemented that you think really can help this situation?
Well, we've seen clerks in Michigan really get out in front of a lot of misinformation prior to Election Day, holding public accuracy tests, for example, of machines, so that people can come in and observe how voting machines actually work, and that paper ballots are still in place, so that we do audits after the fact to verify the results. So the more light we shine on the process, the more we can open the doors and welcome people into it, and the more people serve as poll workers, so they see firsthand the secure protocols we've got in place. That's the best way to debunk the misinformation through those experiences. But we also need less leaders lying to folks as well and spreading misinformation, because that certainly fans the flames every cycle.
Is this a problem that can be fixed in a legislature, or is this a problem that is all about who's holding these jobs?
Yeah, it's about the people. It's about the people who partake in democracy, and it's about voters choosing who runs our elections, secretaries of state, with an eye towards who's going to
Should you be an elected official?
Should the Secretary of State be elected?
Yeah.
I don't. I see myself as a nonpartisan professional, and most election officials at the local level.
But you don't run as a nonpartisan. You do have to run with a party name, and I've always thought it is a challenge. It's a challenge, yeah.
Because you'll see politicians occupy these roles on both sides of the aisle, who then use them as stepping stones.
You've told me you have no interest in any other office.
No, I wrote a book on this office in 2008 because I believe that Republican or Democrat, the person can make this office one that's for the people, not for a particular party. So I've enjoyed being in this role without additional aspirations, because it's enabled to just do my job well for everyone. But you do see, particularly as the spotlight shines more on these offices, an attraction of more political partisan people to them, which is a growing concern for 2024. In 2020, we didn't have any secretary either side of the aisle really join the Stop the Steal movement, and that was really helpful. I don't know if we'll be that fortunate again in 24.
Let me ask a totally off-the-wall question. Are we ever going to have internet voting?
It's possible, but we've got to have a lot of secure protocols in place, not just to ensure that the process is able to be transparent and effective, but also that people can believe.
I don't mean to, I always find our skepticism of this to be odd when all of our money is basically behind a digital firewall, and we're comfortable. I don't want to speak for others, but I'm comfortable with that. Why shouldn't we be comfortable voting on the same sort of secure internet that keeps my banking records from going into your...
Well, the movement may, for some cases, overseas voters, there's electronic transmission of ballots, but you've got to have a paper trail.
Yeah.
And the actual movement is more towards a paper trail, towards paper ballots, at least being the baseline for if there's electronic transmission of the results, so that you can have that paper trail for audits after the fact. I think we'll always need and have that.
It was funny. It's like 15 years ago, we all thought we were headed there sooner than now.
Yeah, we've actually got it the other direction, where more states are adopting paper ballots.
Should we go purple ink?
I don't know, but we'll see. I think there's a lot of changes we need to make to improve our election infrastructure. Perhaps, how we identify voters is one of them. But at the same time, I think some of the structural reforms we'll see, top two primaries, things like that, are more likely to come to automatic voter registration. Those are more of the things that are the immediate trends.
Jocelyn, Benson, I appreciate you spending a few minutes with us.
Thanks for having me.
What was it like to testify in Congress? A little scary?
It was extremely gratifying that in the halls of the U.S. Senate, people listened to our stories about what we're dealing with in the states, and I was grateful for that.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks.
Up next, a legendary voice from high above the field in Dodger Stadium. We remember the improbable and the impossible greatness of play-by-play announcer Vin Scully. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press now.
It's time for Dodger baseball. And look who's coming up. High fly ball into right field. She is gone. In a year that has been so improbable, the impossible has happened.
Welcome back. I still get chills. Legendary play-by-play announcer for the Los Angeles Dodgers. And before that, the Brooklyn Dodgers. Vin Scully passed away yesterday. He was 94. Scully was the voice of the Dodgers for over 6 decades. He moved with the team from Brooklyn to Los Angeles, reaching generations of Dodger fans before retiring in 2016. Think about this. From the broadcasting booth, he watched the likes of Jackie Robinson, Hank Aaron's record-breaking home run, and he called the only perfect game in a World Series. I had the honor of interviewing him at the White House after he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which, of course, is the country's highest civilian honor. Here's a piece. Well, here's something I never thought I'd get to say. Vin Scully, welcome to Meet the Press.
Well, bless your heart. Thank you. It's good to be here, Chuck.
Do you realize that you're helping to stitch together America's social fabric sometimes?
No.
You're just calling a baseball game, huh?
I'm just doing a game, and I'm trying to be accurate. I hope I don't mess up. That's really your thought. If I have a trademark, which I really don't think I have, but I like to call a play quickly, accurately, and then shut up and let the crowd roar.
Joined now by Charlie Steiner. He's at the play-by-play announcer for the Los Angeles Dodgers and got to the honor of working with Vin for those last few years. Charlie, look, I know you became pretty close friends with him. It must be hurting a little bit today.
I'm hurting a lot today, Chuck. I first heard Vin when I was 5 years old, and I wanted to be the announcer for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and this serendipitous journey got me here to Los Angeles in 2005. You know, he was my mentor, he was my idol, and as the years went on, he became a friend of mine. And sometimes I forget, because of the closeness that we had, the enormity of his talent. He was so smart. He was so grounded. He was about as comfortable in his own skin as anybody I've ever been around. His eloquence, his vocabulary, that magical, mystical voice, and his ability to make the complicated sound simple in that moment that happens. Whether it was in the year that is so improbable or it gets through Buckner's legs. But the beauty of Vin and his work wasn't necessarily those calls. It was the body of work on a daily basis, 3 hours of telling a story. And you couldn't wait for the next batter to come up because you would hear something else so eloquently spoken. He was extraordinary. And I'll just shut up after this. Today, I truly feel like Lou Gehrig today. Yeah. Today, I feel like I'm the luckiest man on the face of the planet that I can remember Vin and celebrate. So this may be August the 3rd, 2023, but in some ways, I feel like it's July 4th, 1939.
You know, it's funny you say about he was telling you a story. For me, my exposure to Vin Scully began with the Saturday game of the week, and I was told to pull up a chair, which my dad and I did every Saturday. I had grown up in Miami. We didn't have any baseball to go see. We lived at Vero Beach every time the Dodgers came for spring training. That was my childhood. And it's the storytelling aspect to him that I think just separated him. You know, you're on radio and you've done TV. Is it really him being a radio guy first that made him such a great storyteller?
Absolutely. You know, Vin grew up in radio. He listened to and ultimately worked for Red Barber. I listened to Vin Scully and ultimately worked alongside Vin. Yes, it was radio. And on radio, you have the time and the ability to paint the complete picture, whereas on television, you've got the picture and then your words have to amplify the picture. And he did that better than anybody else.
All right, I got to ask something that's a bit controversial to many Dodger fans. Was Vin Scully a Giants fan?
He grew up a Giant fan. Yes, he did.
It's the hardest thing to accept for many Dodger fans. And there's always been this sneaking suspicion that he's still kind of rooted for the Giants.
He didn't necessarily. He stopped rooting a long time ago, truth be told.
I believe
but he had it's like, you know, you always remember your first love, and the Giants were his first love. He grew up in northern Manhattan, and so when he got the gig, he went to work for the Dodgers. And, you know, beautifully and symmetrically, his last game that he broadcast was against the Giants in San Francisco.
Oh, man. It's is there one call that you just want to listen to over and over again when it comes to him?
The one you played.
Yeah.
I think that's the most perfect sports call, let alone baseball call. You had two brilliant calls in one.
Yeah.
She is gone. And how he uses and amplifies his voice in the moment. And then he comes back in a year that's so improbable. Yeah. When we did the ceremony for Vin 5 or 6 years ago, I said in front of the crowd, that was the most perfect sports broadcasting call ever made. And I stand by that.
Well, if you want to go down the rabbit hole, the entire bottom of the ninth is on the internet. I implore anybody who's never seen that entire bottom of the ninth, go watch it now. Charlie Steiner, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you on to remember Vin Scully. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Geoff, very much.
And thank you all for being with us this hour. Thank you to Hallie Jackson for letting me bleed over about 20 seconds. NBC News Now coverage begins with Hallie right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.